Hell's Angels biker was chasing a dangerous enemy. But what he found in little girl's past will shock you. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Jake Reaper Morrison had always lived a life on the edge. A Hells Angels biker with a reputation that could make grown men shudder, he was no stranger to danger. His life had been a series of high-speed chases, the thrill of the open road, and the constant chase of enemies who thought they could outsmart him. But that night, something was different. As Jake roared down the rain-slicked highway, his mind was focused solely on his target, a dangerous enemy who had crossed the line one too many times. His knuckles tightened around the handlebars of his Harley, the engine's deep rumble cutting through the storm. He wasn't just chasing a criminal. He was chasing revenge, a chance to settle old scores. But little did he know, fate had a different plan for him. As he veered off the main road, he spotted a flash of movement out of the corner of his eye. A small figure, barely visible in the darkness, lying on the side of the road. Without a second thought, Jake slammed on the brakes, his bike skidding to a halt in the wet gravel. He swung his leg off the bike and rushed to the figure lying motionless in the ditch. As he knelt beside her, his heart skipped a beat. It was a little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, her small body shivering in the cold rain. Her face was pale, and her clothes were torn, a clear sign of someone who had been through hell. Her breath came in shallow gasps, barely audible over the pounding rain. For a moment, Jake froze. His mind told him to keep going, to finish what he had started, but something in the girl's eyes stopped him cold. There was fear there. Yes, but also something else. A kind of helplessness that struck a chord deep within him. He had always been the one to protect, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. But this was different. He gently lifted her from the cold ground, cradling her fragile body in his arms. "Hey, it's okay," he muttered, though his voice lacked the confidence he usually had in these kinds of situations. The girl's wide eyes met his, and for a moment, she seemed to understand. Her lips parted as if she was about to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she just looked at him with a mix of fear and confusion. He knew he had to get her somewhere safe, but the nearest shelter was miles away, and the storm wasn't letting up. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. There was nothing. Just the howling wind and the relentless rain. It was then that he noticed something strange, a small, worn-out teddy bear clutched tightly in her hands. It seemed out of place, considering the circumstances, but it was also the one thing that seemed to bring her comfort. "What happened to you, kid?" Jake whispered, brushing the wet strands of hair from her face. She didn't respond, but the tremble in her body told him everything he needed to know. She had been through something far worse than just an accident. With no other option, Jake carefully carried her back to his bike. He placed her on the seat in front of him, making sure she was secure before starting the engine. The sound of the Harley filled the air once more, but this time it was different. Jake wasn't just riding to chase an enemy. He was riding to protect someone who needed him. As the bike roared back to life, Jake's mind raced. Who was this girl? What had happened to her? And why did she seem so familiar? Little did he know, the answers would soon come, and they would change everything he thought he knew about the world he lived in. The rain was relentless as Jake Reaper Morrison rode his Harley down the slick highway, the storm still howling around him. The little girl was still nestled in front of him on the bike, clinging to him for warmth and safety. Despite the cold, the warmth of her small body against his chest gave him a sense of comfort he hadn't felt in a long time. Jake's mind raced, but not about the enemy he had been chasing. The thought of her kept pushing forward, taking over every other concern. He needed to get her somewhere safe, somewhere far from whatever nightmare she had just come from. The cold wind bit through his leather jacket, but the girl's quiet sobs, muffled by the roar of the bike, broke his focus. They had to get out of the storm, and they had to get to shelter before the night swallowed them whole. As they sped down the deserted road, Jake noticed a small cabin in the distance. A dim light flickered from behind the window, offering a glimmer of hope. Without a second thought, he veered off the road, his tires kicking up mud as he made his way up the small driveway. He stopped the bike in front of the cabin, carefully dismounting and then gently lifting the girl from her place on the bike. She seemed even smaller now that she was off the bike, her tiny frame shaking with cold. Jake carefully carried her inside, where the warmth of the cabin felt like a blessing. The wooden floors creaked under their weight as Jake laid the girl down on the worn couch. He immediately went to the small fireplace and started a fire, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows across the room. The cabin was small but comfortable. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The girl's breath came in shallow bursts, and Jake knew he needed to check her over, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. She was scared, and it was clear that she had been through a lot. Jake tried his best to stay calm, even though his heart was racing. He went to the small kitchen and found a clean cloth, soaking it in warm water before bringing it back to her. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly, kneeling next to her on the couch. "I'm just going to clean you up, all right?" The girl nodded slowly, her eyes wide with fear but trusting. He gently wiped the dirt from her face, noticing the bruises that dotted her skin, signs of a life filled with pain she didn't deserve. His stomach churned at the thought of anyone hurting her. "What's your name, little one?" Jake asked, his voice gentle, though he could feel the weight of his own emotions pressing down on him. The girl hesitated, then whispered, "Emma." "Emma," Jake repeated, his heart softening even more. "I'm Jake. I'm going to make sure you're all right. You're safe now, okay?" Emma didn't speak for a while, but she kept her gaze on him, her eyes flicking from his face to his hands, still covered in the dirt of the road. He couldn't help but notice how much she seemed to study him, as though she were trying to understand who he really was. "Where did you come from, Emma?" Jake asked quietly, knowing that this was a question she might not be ready to answer, but he had to ask. Emma looked away, her small hands fidgeting with the edge of the blanket Jake had thrown over her. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know where I came from. I don't remember." Jake didn't push her further, not wanting to force her into sharing anything she wasn't ready to talk about. He sat down beside her, still looking at her, trying to process everything. Who would leave a child like this? What had happened to her? What was she running from? He didn't know, but he knew one thing for sure. She was no longer alone. Jake wasn't going to let anything happen to her, not if he had a say in it. As the fire crackled and Emma's breathing slowed, Jake stood and went to the window, looking out into the storm. The wind was picking up again, howling as it blew against the cabin's walls. But inside, the warmth was enough to chase away the chill, and for the first time in a long while, Jake allowed himself to relax, even if just a little. He turned back to Emma, who was now asleep on the couch, her tiny form curled up under the blanket he had placed around her. She was safe, for now. But Jake knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was only just beginning. The past was always lurking, ready to catch up with them, and he had no idea what secrets Emma's past held. But he was determined to find out. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. Jake sat by the fire, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. The crackling sound of the fire seemed to match the chaotic thoughts in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that Emma's presence in his life wasn't just some coincidence. There was something about her, something familiar, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He rubbed his hands together to warm them, the rough skin of his palms a reminder of the harsh life he had led. His time in the Hells Angels had taken a toll on him, both physically and mentally. He had learned to trust few people, but there was something about Emma's vulnerability that made him want to protect her. He hadn't felt that kind of pull in years, not since he lost his own daughter. He forced the thought away. He couldn't afford to dwell on the past. Emma was here now, and he had to focus on keeping her safe. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, it felt strangely peaceful. Emma was asleep on the couch, her small body curled up under the blanket Jake had draped over her. He watched her sleep for a moment, her face soft and relaxed, free from the fear and pain that had been etched into her expression earlier. It struck him how much he wanted to shield her from whatever darkness she was running from. The storm had passed, but Jake knew the real storm was yet to come. There were questions, too many questions. Who was after her? What had happened to her? He wasn't sure if Emma even knew the answers herself. He was pulled from his thoughts by the sound of Emma stirring in her sleep. She groggily opened her eyes, blinking against the dim light of the cabin. Jake immediately moved closer, his voice soft as he spoke. Hey, it's okay. You're safe here. Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide with the kind of innocence that tugged at his heart. Where am I? She asked, her voice shaky. You're at my place, Jake said, trying to reassure her with his calm tone. You were hurt, and I brought you here to get you out of the storm. Emma nodded slowly, taking in her surroundings. The silence between them was heavy, and Jake could feel her trying to piece together the events that had led her here. He wanted to ask her more questions, to understand what had happened to her, but he could see the hesitation in her eyes. She wasn't ready to talk yet. I don't remember much, Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. It's okay, Jake said, his voice gentle. Take your time. He sat down beside her, his eyes watching her carefully, but not pushing. There was a part of him that wanted to know everything. Who had hurt her, why she was alone, but he knew he had to wait for her to trust him. The night stretched on in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional howl of the wind outside. As Emma drifted back into a restless sleep, Jake couldn't help but wonder what her past held. He knew there was more to her story than she was letting on, but he also knew that pushing her too hard would only drive her further away. He had to wait. He had to be patient. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. As the hours passed, and the fire slowly dwindled, Jake's thoughts returned to the enemy he had been chasing before Emma had come into his life. That danger was still out there, lurking in the shadows. But now, there was a new priority. Emma was his responsibility now, and he would protect her, no matter what it took. With one final glance at the sleeping girl, Jake stood up and walked over to the small window. The storm had cleared, but the darkness of the night was still thick around the cabin. He knew it wouldn't be long before someone came looking for Emma, and when they did, he would be ready. He wouldn't let them take her. He had already lost too much in his life. He wasn't about to let that happen again. The sun began to rise, casting a soft orange light through the small windows of the cabin. Jake woke to the sound of Emma stirring beside him, her small body shifting under the blanket he had given her. He watched her for a moment, still unsure of the full story she carried with her, but knowing that her presence had already begun to change something deep inside him. The night had passed without incident, but Jake knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Emma, still waking up, blinked up at him with tired eyes. Morning, she whispered, her voice soft and unsure. Morning, Jake replied, giving her a small smile. He was still trying to adjust to the feeling of having someone else around. His life had always been solitary, filled with the roar of engines and the constant tension of life on the road. But this was different. Emma was different. She wasn't asking for much. She was simply here, in need of protection, and Jake knew that he could provide that. How are you feeling? He asked, his voice gentle. I think I'm okay, she replied, sitting up slowly. Her body was small and fragile, but there was something about her that made Jake want to protect her with everything he had. Good, Jake said, standing up and stretching his sore muscles. I'm going to make some coffee. You can rest here, okay? Emma nodded, wrapping the blanket tighter around her. Jake made his way to the kitchen area, the old wood creaking beneath his boots. As he set about brewing the coffee, his thoughts wandered. What had brought Emma here? Who had hurt her? And why did he feel this overwhelming need to keep her safe? He shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew that he couldn't let her go. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. After a few minutes, Jake returned with a cup of coffee in his hands and handed it to Emma. It's hot, so be careful, he said softly, watching as she took the cup, her small hands trembling slightly. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a quiet moment between them, neither of them speaking, just the sound of the wind outside and the occasional crack of the fire. Finally, Emma broke the silence. Why are you helping me? She asked, her voice barely audible. Jake looked at her, surprised by the question. He had never really stopped to think about it. He just knew he had to. I don't know, he replied honestly. Maybe because you remind me of someone I used to care about. Emma looked at him, her eyes wide with curiosity. Who? She asked. Jake hesitated. He hadn't spoken about his daughter in years. The pain of losing her was still raw, even though he tried to bury it. My daughter, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. She would have been about your age. I wasn't there for her when she needed me the most. Emma didn't speak for a moment, but her eyes softened with understanding. She had no way of knowing the depth of Jake's pain, but she could sense the sorrow in his voice. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It's not your fault," Jake said, forcing a smile. "We all make mistakes." The room was quiet for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the soft hum of the wind outside. Jake felt a strange comfort in the silence, as though the weight of the past was slowly starting to lift. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he wasn't alone anymore. He had Emma now, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was fighting the world alone. After a while, Jake stood up and went to the window. He could feel a change in the air. It wasn't just the storm that had passed. There was something else, something lurking just beyond the horizon. He knew the danger was still out there, but for the first time, he didn't feel like he was running from it. He was standing still, waiting, watching, and he was ready. "We need to get out of here soon," Jake said, turning to Emma. "The storm has passed, but we can't stay here forever. There's someone looking for you, and we need to figure out who." Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear, but there was something else in them now. "Trust." "I'm ready," she said quietly. "I'll go with you." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of his promise to her settle on his shoulders. He wasn't just protecting her now. He was saving both of them. Together, they would face whatever came next. Jake and Emma had been on the road for hours, the sun now setting low behind them, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The highway stretched out before them, endless and empty, but Jake didn't mind the solitude. It gave him time to think, to process everything that had happened. He had been living life on the edge for so long, but now, with Emma at his side, everything felt different. She had opened something in him. Something he hadn't known was still there. As much as he tried to focus on the road, his mind kept drifting back to her, the little girl who had unknowingly become his responsibility. He couldn't deny the bond he felt growing between them. She had been through so much, and yet there was something about her that made Jake believe she was stronger than she looked. But there was also fear in her eyes, a fear that came from being chased, from running away from something that Jake couldn't yet understand. Emma sat behind him on the bike, her small arms wrapped around his waist for support. The ride had been smooth so far, but Jake knew they couldn't keep moving forever. They had to stop, to find a place to lay low. He had been keeping an eye out for a town, any sign of civilization, but so far, the road had been desolate. The tension in the air was palpable. Jake could feel it in his bones. Something was coming, and he wasn't sure what it was. Was it the people after Emma? Or was it something else, something he hadn't prepared for? He couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was about to take a sharp turn. As they reached the crest of a hill, Jake spotted a small diner off to the side of the road. It wasn't much, just a rundown building with a flickering neon sign that read "Open." Jake slowed the bike and turned toward it, his grip on the handlebars tight. He could sense that Emma was nervous, her body tense against his back, but he didn't let on. He knew they needed a break. As they pulled into the parking lot, Jake surveyed the area. There were a few cars parked outside, but no sign of trouble. He killed the engine and helped Emma off the bike. She looked up at the diner, her eyes scanning the building with caution. Jake gave her a reassuring smile, but he could see the unease in her expression. "Stay close," he said softly. "We'll just grab a bite to eat and get back on the road." Emma nodded, but she didn't say anything. Jake led her into the diner, the bell above the door chiming softly as they entered. The place was small, dimly lit, with a handful of booths scattered around. The air smelled of old coffee and frying bacon. A waitress behind the counter looked up at them, her face neutral but her eyes sharp. She didn't seem surprised to see them, just another couple of travelers passing through. Jake motioned to Emma to take a seat at one of the booths while he went to the counter. He ordered 2 coffees and a couple of sandwiches, his mind still racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. As the waitress prepared their order, Jake sat down across from Emma. She was quiet, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. Jake could tell she was deep in thought, but he didn't press her. He understood what it was like to carry a heavy burden, to keep everything locked inside. But it didn't stop the concern from creeping up in him. He had a feeling that Emma wasn't just running from something. She was running toward something. He could see it in the way she held herself, the way she carried that sadness behind her eyes. But Jake didn't have the answers. Not yet. He only knew one thing. He wasn't going to let her face whatever was coming alone. The waitress set their food down in front of them, and Jake gave her a small nod of thanks. He didn't speak as he picked up his sandwich, but his mind was working, his thoughts swirling around the mystery of Emma's past. He needed to know more. He had to. But for now, all he could do was wait. Wait for her to open up. Wait for the answers to come. As they ate in silence, the minutes seemed to stretch on, each one heavier than the last. Jake could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had a past that he couldn't escape, a past that had led him to this moment. But Emma's past was different. It was a secret, one that she wasn't ready to share. And that was okay. He didn't need to know everything right away. But Jake was determined to help her, to be there for her in whatever way he could. They couldn't stay at the diner forever. They had to keep moving, keep running from whatever was chasing them. But for now, this was enough. They were together, and that was all that mattered. Jake and Emma had barely finished their meal when the sound of a distant motorcycle engine began to break through the stillness of the diner. At first, it was just a faint hum, barely noticeable over the clink of cutlery and low chatter of other patrons. But as the engine grew louder, Jake's instincts immediately kicked in. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide with concern. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft, but laced with a hint of fear. Jake didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the door, his eyes scanning the parking lot outside through the diner's large windows. The unmistakable sound of a motorcycle approaching, louder now, more pronounced, sent a jolt through his body. It was too close, too familiar. "Stay here," he said in a low voice, his tone firm but trying not to alarm her. He moved quickly to the window, his boots tapping softly against the worn floorboards. Through the rain streaking the glass, Jake could see a black motorcycle pulling into the lot, the rider's leather jacket glinting under the dim light. His heart skipped a beat. It was the unmistakable look of a Hell's Angel. Not just any rider. One who had a history with Jake. "Stay low," Jake added, turning back to Emma. "Do not leave this booth. Don't even move unless I tell you to." Emma nodded, her face pale with uncertainty. She had no idea what was happening, but the tension in Jake's voice was enough to make her obey without question. Jake quickly made his way to the back of the diner, his mind racing. He couldn't let his past catch up with him now. Not when Emma was in the picture. The biker outside had to be connected to someone from his old life. The footsteps of the rider echoed in the parking lot as the engine was cut off, followed by the soft thud of boots hitting the pavement. Jake's mind was already turning, calculating the risk. Who was it? Was it someone from his past who had finally caught up to him? He had no time to waste. The biker was heading toward the diner now, and there was no way he could let him walk in here and start asking questions. He had to make sure Emma was safe. Jake slipped behind the counter and grabbed a worn baseball cap from the shelf, pulling it down low over his face. He needed to blend in, to make sure no one recognized him. He couldn't afford to make a scene, not yet, anyway. The bell above the diner's door jingled as the biker entered. Jake didn't need to look to know it was him. The weight of the man's presence filled the room, and the air seemed to shift. The biker was tall, with a broad frame and dark sunglasses. His leather vest was adorned with patches that marked him as part of the club, Jake's old club. Jake's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. The biker scanned the room, his eyes briefly meeting Jake's before quickly moving on. He was looking for something, or someone. Jake could feel the weight of his stare, the familiarity in it, but he couldn't afford to acknowledge it. The last thing he wanted was to start a confrontation. He was no longer a part of that world. The biker walked up to the counter and ordered a coffee. His voice was rough, like gravel being dragged across a stone floor. "2 sugars," he said to the waitress before turning to look at Jake again. This time, the recognition was unmistakable. The biker's eyes narrowed slightly, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Reaper?" the man asked, his tone both questioning and mocking. Jake's jaw clenched. His old name felt like a foreign word now, one he had left behind long ago. But there was no escaping it, no running from the past that had defined him for so long. "It's been a while," the biker added, a grin spreading across his face. Jake didn't respond. He just kept his eyes on the counter, pretending not to hear. The biker walked past him, sitting at a table near the back of the diner, but Jake could feel the tension rising. Emma was still sitting at the booth, her wide eyes darting between Jake and the biker. She didn't know what was happening, but she could sense the change in the air. Jake had to get them out of here, fast. But the question remained, why was this man here? Did he know something about Emma? Or was he just another ghost from Jake's past, come to haunt him once again? As the biker sipped his coffee, Jake's mind raced. He had no choice but to stay calm, to not give away any signs that he recognized the man. The last thing he wanted was to make Emma a target. Jake shifted his weight, casually glancing over at Emma. She was still sitting quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She was scared, but she wasn't showing it. Jake nodded slightly, reassuring her without words. They had to stay one step ahead of whatever was coming. Reaper, I know it's you, the biker said again, his voice louder now. Jake stiffened, but still didn't respond. He had no idea what this man wanted, but he wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a conversation. The biker stood up abruptly, walking toward the door. As he reached the exit, he turned around, a smirk on his face. I'll be seeing you, Reaper. Don't think this is over. With that, the door swung open, and the biker was gone, his motorcycle roaring back to life outside. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. His pulse still raced, but the immediate threat had passed. For now. But the warning was clear. The past had come calling, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. The sound of the motorcycle engine slowly faded as the biker disappeared into the distance, leaving nothing but the echoes of his presence behind. Jake stood frozen, his hand gripping the edge of the table, his mind racing. He could still feel the tension in the air, thick with the unspoken words between him and the man from his past. He didn't know exactly why the biker had come to the diner, but he knew one thing. It was far from over. The storm had passed, but the dark cloud of his old life loomed ever closer. Jake turned back to Emma, who was sitting silently at the booth, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and fear. She had been quiet since the biker had entered the diner, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, but not understanding what was happening. Her small hands were trembling, but she wasn't speaking, her eyes following Jake as he moved back to the booth. He sat down across from her, the chair scraping against the floor as he tried to collect his thoughts. You okay? Jake asked, his voice soft, though the tension was still present in his tone. Emma nodded slowly, but it was clear she was still scared. Who was that? She finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to go into the details of his past with her, not yet. Just someone I used to know, Jake said, keeping his answer vague. He's gone now. But Emma wasn't satisfied with that. She had seen the way Jake had tensed up when the biker had spoken to him. There was more to the story than he was letting on, and she knew it. Why did he call you Reaper? Emma asked, her voice small but insistent. Jake's eyes flicked to the door, as if checking to see if the biker had returned, then back to Emma. He could see the curiosity in her eyes, the desire to understand what was happening. He couldn't lie to her, not anymore. But he wasn't ready to fully open up either. It's a nickname, Jake said, his voice quiet. From a long time ago. Emma's gaze softened, as if she could sense the pain behind Jake's words. She didn't press him further. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, she said, her tone gentle. Jake gave her a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Thanks, kid, he said, his voice rough with emotion. The silence between them was comfortable, but Jake knew it wouldn't last. They couldn't stay in the diner forever. They had to keep moving. They had to stay ahead of whatever danger was closing in on them. We need to go, Jake said after a few moments, his voice firm now. We can't stay here any longer. Emma nodded, her face set with determination. She wasn't going to let fear stop her. She had already come this far. She wasn't going to turn back now. Jake stood up and made his way to the counter, paying for the meal with cash, trying to stay inconspicuous. As he walked out of the diner, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The sun had set completely now, and the streets outside were bathed in the harsh glow of streetlights. The air was still, but there was a sense of impending danger that Jake couldn't ignore. As he started the motorcycle, he glanced back at Emma, who was already sitting behind him, ready to go. Hold on tight, he said, his voice steady. Emma wrapped her arms around his waist, her grip tight but trusting. As Jake revved the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, he could feel the weight of his past bearing down on him, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. He had to focus on getting Emma to safety. That was all that mattered now. They rode in silence for a while, the wind whipping past them as the world blurred around them. Jake's mind was focused on the road, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the biker. Who was he really? Why had he come looking for Jake? And what did he want with Emma? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. Not while he still had a breath in his body. They needed to get to a place where they could figure things out, where they could plan their next move. Jake knew they couldn't outrun the past forever. But for now, he had to keep running, keep protecting Emma, until they were both safe. They needed time to figure out who was after them and why. But time was something they didn't have a lot of. As they sped down the empty highway, Jake's eyes scanned the road ahead. The night was still and quiet, but Jake knew that wouldn't last long. Whatever was coming, he had to be ready. And so did Emma. The night air was cool, and the motorcycle hummed steadily beneath Jake as they cruised down the empty highway. The neon lights from the small towns they passed reflected off the wet pavement, giving everything a dreamlike quality. It was peaceful in a way, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep in his chest. Emma had been quiet for a while, her small form pressed close against his back, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. He could feel her trembling slightly, but he couldn't tell if it was from the cold or from the lingering fear that had taken hold of her since they had left the diner. As they rode, Jake's thoughts raced. The biker had been looking. For him, that much was clear. But why? And why had he recognized him? Was this just a random encounter, or was there something bigger at play here? Jake's mind kept returning to the man's words, the way he had said his old name. Reaper. It felt like a lifetime ago, a past he had tried to bury, and yet here it was, following him. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like trouble was finding him again, no matter how far he tried to run. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was Emma. Whatever was chasing him, whatever was lurking in his past, it was now in her life too. And he couldn't let that happen. Not again. The rumble of the engine was the only sound between them, the wind whipping through the trees on either side of the road. He couldn't help but glance over his shoulder every now and then, checking for any signs of danger, but the road remained empty, quiet. It was almost too quiet. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice low, though he wasn't sure if he was asking Emma or himself. "Yeah," she replied softly, her voice muffled by the wind. He could tell she wasn't completely convinced, but she was trying to be brave. She had been through more than any child should, and he knew she wasn't the type to show weakness. He admired that about her, but it didn't make him feel any less responsible for what was happening to her. "We'll be fine," Jake said, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince Emma or himself. They had to be fine. He couldn't let anything happen to her. They had driven for hours without a clear destination in mind, just following the road, hoping to find some place to lay low. Jake knew they couldn't keep running forever, but right now, it felt like they didn't have much of a choice. Every town they passed through felt like a potential threat, every shadow a reminder that they were being hunted. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake spotted a small motel up ahead. The faded neon sign flickered, announcing that it was still open. He pulled into the parking lot, the gravel crunching under the tires. The place looked worn, but it would do. They needed to rest, even if just for a few hours. As Jake killed the engine and helped Emma off the bike, he glanced around cautiously. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention. They had to be careful. "Stay close," Jake said as they walked toward the motel office. Emma nodded, her small hand gripping his sleeve as they approached the door. Inside, the air smelled of old coffee and something else, something faintly musty, but it was a safe haven compared to the uncertainty outside. The clerk behind the counter gave them a tired look, but didn't say anything. Jake paid in cash, his eyes never leaving the man's face as he grabbed the key to the nearest room. They were lucky. No one seemed to be watching them. No one seemed to notice their arrival. Jake led Emma to their room, a small, dimly lit space with a queen-sized bed and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. It wasn't much, but it was all they needed for now. Jake locked the door behind them and set the bike keys on the nightstand. He took a deep breath and finally allowed himself to relax, even if just for a moment. Emma sat down on the bed, her eyes darting around the room. "This is it?" she asked, her voice small but curious. "Yeah," Jake said, offering her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's not much, but it's enough for now." He could see the unease in her expression, the way her eyes searched the room for any signs of danger. She was on edge, and he didn't blame her. They both were. The weight of their situation was hanging heavy in the air, and Jake could feel it pressing on his chest. But for now, they were safe. For now, they had a moment of peace. Jake went to the window and pulled the curtain aside, glancing out into the darkened parking lot. He could see the shadows of cars parked nearby, but nothing out of the ordinary. He wasn't sure if it was the calm before the storm, or if they had just found a temporary reprieve. Either way, he knew they couldn't stay here long. He had to figure out their next move. "We'll get some rest," Jake said, turning back to Emma. "But we can't stay here forever. We need to keep moving." Emma nodded, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "I understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I trust you." Jake's heart clenched. He wasn't used to anyone trusting him, not like this. But Emma's words hit him harder than he expected. He would do whatever it took to protect her. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Jake woke up to the faint light of dawn creeping through the edges of the motel curtains. The events of the previous day felt like a distant memory, though the weight of the looming danger never fully left him. The bed was too small, the room too quiet, but for the first time in what felt like ages, Jake allowed himself to rest. He turned over to see Emma still asleep, her small form curled up under the thick blanket. She had been through so much already, and yet she still looked like the same scared little girl he had found that night. But Jake could see a shift in her, something in her eyes that had softened, as if she were beginning to trust him. He couldn't afford to let that trust slip away. He had promised to protect her, and he was going to keep that promise. The biker's visit at the diner still lingered in his thoughts, like a shadow that wouldn't leave him alone. He had hoped that the past would stay buried, that he could live his life on his terms, but that wasn't the case anymore. The past had a way of catching up with you, whether you were ready for it or not. Jake rubbed his face, trying to shake off the exhaustion that still clung to him. He needed to figure out their next move. They couldn't stay here forever. They needed to keep moving, find a place where Emma would be safe. He couldn't let whatever was chasing them catch up to them. The sound of Emma shifting in her sleep brought Jake's attention back to her. He smiled softly, watching her for a moment before standing up and walking toward the small bathroom. The room was still and quiet, and for a moment, it felt like they were in a bubble, away from the world and all the danger that lurked outside. But Jake knew that wouldn't last long. He had to be ready. When he finished in the bathroom, he looked out the small window, scanning the parking lot. It was still early, and the motel was mostly empty, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something in the air, a feeling of unease that seemed to hang around them like a storm cloud. He needed to get Emma out of here. As he turned to leave, he saw her sitting up on the bed, rubbing her eyes sleepily. "Morning," she said softly, her voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," Jake replied, forcing a smile. "You sleep okay?" Emma nodded, though Jake could see the uncertainty still in her eyes. She was trying to be brave, but he could tell she was still afraid. She didn't ask questions about what had happened the day before, about the biker or the life Jake had led. She was smart enough to know that some things weren't meant to be talked about. But Jake could feel her looking to him for answers, for reassurance. And he didn't have any. All he could do was keep moving, keep protecting her. "We need to head out soon," Jake said, walking over to the window again, peering out into the parking lot. "We can't stay here much longer." Emma nodded, her eyes still heavy with exhaustion but determined. She didn't want to be a burden. She was trying to do what she could to help, to be strong for him. Jake felt a lump form in his throat. She shouldn't have to be strong, not at her age. He wished he could take away all the fear and pain she had endured, but he couldn't. All he could do was keep her safe, even if he didn't know how to do that. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm ready." Jake's heart clenched at her words. She didn't have to say anything more. He understood. She was ready to keep moving, ready to face whatever came next, as long as he was there to protect her. They were in this together, whether he wanted to admit it or not. "Okay," Jake said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts inside his head. "Let's get going." They gathered their things quickly, and Jake made sure to check the room one last time, even though he knew they wouldn't be coming back. He didn't trust the quiet. It was too still, too easy to forget that danger was always just around the corner. Once they were outside, Jake strapped his helmet on, starting the bike and feeling the familiar hum of the engine beneath him. Emma climbed on behind him, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist. He could feel her heart beating against his back, a reminder of the fragile trust she had placed in him. "We'll find a safe place," Jake muttered under his breath. though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring her or himself. The road stretched out before them, endless and unknown. There were no clear answers, no guarantees, but Jake knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't stop until Emma was safe. He couldn't protect her forever, but for as long as she needed him, he would fight. With a deep breath, Jake revved the engine, and they sped off down the empty highway, the world blurring around them as the past and the future collided in the distance. The road ahead was long and winding, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it was still just the calm before the storm. The bike hummed beneath him, the steady rhythm of the engine offering a brief moment of clarity amidst the chaos. Emma's small form was pressed tightly against his back, her arms securely wrapped around his waist. He could feel her body tense slightly with every turn, her grip firm, but he knew she was still trying to adjust to everything that had happened. The way she held herself, so quietly brave, only added weight to the promise Jake had made to himself the night he found her. He would protect her at all costs. There was no going back now. As the miles ticked by, the sun started to climb higher in the sky, casting its bright rays over the open road. The landscape around them was shifting, empty plains giving way to low hills and scattered forests in the distance. Jake had been riding for hours, and though he was exhausted, he knew they couldn't afford to stop just yet. They needed to keep moving, to stay one step ahead of whoever might be after them. They had no idea who they were up against, but Jake knew the longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was they'd be found. They needed a plan. Emma's voice broke through his thoughts. "Jake, where are we going?" she asked quietly, her voice still tinged with the uncertainty she hadn't yet shaken. Jake glanced over his shoulder at her for a moment before focusing back on the road. He wasn't sure where they were going. He had no real destination in mind, but he had to come up with something. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but we'll figure it out." He could hear the hesitation in his own words, and he hated it. The weight of the unknown pressed on him, but there was no room for fear, not now. "I promise we'll be okay. We just need to keep moving." Emma seemed to accept that, though the worry was still clear in her eyes. The wind whipped past them as they rode, the world rushing by at speeds that made everything feel a little surreal. There was a part of Jake that felt like he was living someone else's life, caught in a world of constant motion, never quite grounded in reality. He had been running for so long, but this time, it wasn't just him. This time, Emma was with him. They were a team now, for better or worse. "What do you think will happen next?" Emma asked after a long pause, her voice small, but full of curiosity. Jake felt the weight of her question. He had no answers, no surefire way to make things right, but he would be damned if he let her feel like she was alone. "I don't know," he said, his voice steady but low. "But whatever happens, we face it together." They fell into a comfortable silence after that. Jake didn't know how much longer they would be on the road, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the calm would end soon. That gut feeling he had, the one that told him something was coming, that danger was closing in, never quite left him. As much as he wanted to push the thought aside, he knew it was only a matter of time before whatever had been lurking in the shadows would finally catch up to them. Emma seemed to sense the shift in the air. "Jake?" she asked softly, her voice quiet but carrying a weight of its own. "Yeah," he replied, glancing back at her. "Are you scared?" Jake was silent for a moment. It was a simple question, but one that cut through all the layers of bravado and confidence he had built up over the years. He had spent so much of his life pretending to be unshakable, pretending to have all the answers. But standing here, in this moment, with Emma relying on him, Jake realized just how much of a facade it all was. He had no control over the future. No matter how hard he tried to fight the world, he couldn't outrun the past, and he couldn't predict the danger that lay ahead. "Yeah, I am," Jake admitted, his voice rougher than he intended. "But we're not running anymore. We're facing it together." Emma didn't say anything after that, but Jake could feel her presence beside him, a quiet reminder that they were in this together, no matter what. The rest of the day passed slowly, the hours stretching into one another like an endless blur. They stopped only for brief moments, just long enough to refuel and stretch their legs before getting back on the road. Jake kept his eyes on the horizon, the road unfolding ahead of him like an open invitation to keep running, to keep pushing forward. But as the day turned into evening, Jake knew they couldn't keep going forever. They needed rest, a place to lay low, a place where they could think. He spotted a small town in the distance and decided to take a detour. It was a quiet little place, nothing like the big cities Jake was used to, and it seemed like the perfect place to stop for the night. As they pulled into a small motel parking lot, Jake's eyes scanned the area, always looking over his shoulder, always watching for threats. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake allowed himself to breathe a little easier. It was just a motel, a place to rest their weary bodies, and for tonight, that was enough. "Let's get some sleep," Jake said, turning off the bike. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out our next move." Emma nodded and followed him to the door of the motel room, her small hand slipping into his. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they would be okay. Jake woke up to the faint sound of birds chirping outside the motel window. The morning sun filtered in through the curtains, casting a soft light over the small room. Emma was still asleep on the bed, curled up under the blanket, her small chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. Jake sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes as he tried to shake off the heaviness in his mind. The night had been quiet, too quiet, and the tension that had been building in him for days had not disappeared. He didn't know how much longer they could keep running, but for now, the motel was a temporary haven, and that was all he could focus on. He glanced over at Emma, her innocent face relaxed in sleep, and the weight of his responsibility hit him again. He had promised to protect her, but the danger was still out there. He didn't know who was after her or why, but it didn't matter. He would find out, and he would make sure she was safe. Standing up, Jake stretched his sore muscles, the stiffness from hours on the bike still lingering in his body. The road ahead wasn't going to be any easier, and the sooner they could figure out where to go next, the better. He walked over to the small table by the window and looked outside. The town was quiet, but that didn't mean it was safe. He needed to keep his guard up. They couldn't afford to trust anyone, not yet. The last thing he needed was for someone to recognize him from his past. His old life had a way of creeping back up when he least expected it. Jake turned back to the bed and watched Emma for a moment, his heart heavy. She had been through so much already, and it wasn't fair. She deserved to be a kid, to live a life free from fear, but that wasn't their reality. Their reality was filled with uncertainty and danger. He couldn't change that, but he could protect her, and that was the only thing that mattered. He grabbed his jacket and slipped it on, checking the room one last time. Nothing was out of place, but Jake wasn't about to take any chances. He had learned the hard way that complacency could be deadly. As he stepped out of the room and into the parking lot, the cool morning air hit him, the breeze carrying the scent of the nearby trees. It was a small, quiet town, but something about it felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach wouldn't go away. He walked over to the bike, checking it over carefully. The engine was still in good shape, but it never hurt to make sure everything was secure. After a few minutes, he walked back inside to find Emma sitting up on the bed, rubbing her eyes sleepily. "Morning," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," Jake replied, offering her a small smile. "You sleep okay?" Emma nodded, though her eyes seemed to be searching him, trying to gauge his mood. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft but perceptive. Jake hesitated. He didn't want to scare her, but he couldn't lie either. "Nothing's wrong," he said, his voice steady. "Just thinking." Emma nodded, though she didn't seem convinced. She was smart for her age, too smart sometimes. But Jake didn't want to burden her with his worries. He was the one who was supposed to be protecting her, not the other way around. "We need to get moving," Jake said after a beat. "We can't stay here long. We don't know who's looking for us." Emma nodded again, this time more resolutely, and Jake could see that she trusted him. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not like before. "Okay," she said, her voice small but firm. "I'm ready." Jake packed up their things quickly, making sure everything was in order. He had a plan, though it wasn't a good one. They would ride through the next town over, stay low, keep their heads down. He didn't know how long they would be on the run, but he would make sure Emma was safe for as long as he could. They couldn't afford to take any risks. As they walked out to the bike, Jake paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the quiet street once more. Everything seemed normal, too normal. It felt like they were being watched, but he couldn't spot anyone who looked out of place. He shook the feeling off. They had to move, and the sooner they did, the better. Emma climbed onto the bike behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. Jake started the engine, the low rumble vibrating through his body as they sped off, the wind whipping through their hair. The road stretched ahead, and for a moment, Jake felt a sense of calm. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As they rode, the uncertainty of what was to come hung over them like a dark cloud. They didn't know where the road would take them, but they couldn't stop. Jake wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. He would keep going for Emma. They had no other choice. The sun had risen higher in the sky by the time they reached the edge of a small, quiet town. Jake had been riding for hours, his mind constantly on alert, scanning the road, watching for any signs of danger. His eyes never stayed still for long. There were too many memories lurking in the back of his mind, too many ghosts from the past he couldn't outrun. But for now, he had to focus on Emma. She had been silent for most of the ride, her small arms still wrapped around his waist as they cruised down the winding road. Jake could feel the tension in her, the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from her even when she tried to stay still. He could tell that she was scared, but she wasn't showing it. Not like she had before. Something had changed in her. She had begun to trust him, to rely on him in a way that he wasn't sure he deserved. But he would keep that trust, no matter the cost. The town was small, barely more than a few blocks with a single gas station and a couple of storefronts. It wasn't much, but it was exactly what they needed. Jake had always believed in keeping a low profile, especially when he had something, or someone, worth protecting. They couldn't afford to draw attention to themselves, not now. As they entered the town, Jake slowed the bike, glancing around to make sure no one was watching them too closely. The place seemed quiet, almost too quiet. Jake knew better than to trust appearances. He had been on the run long enough to recognize when something didn't feel right. But for now, they had to take the risk. "We're going to stay here for a bit," Jake said, his voice calm, though there was an edge to it. "We'll find a place to rest, get our bearings." Emma didn't say anything, but Jake could feel her nodding against his back. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running like this. He had no plan, no safe place to go. All he had was Emma and the promise he had made to her. And that had to be enough. They pulled into a small parking lot outside a rundown motel. It wasn't much, just a few rooms and a faded neon sign, but it would do. Jake didn't bother looking for a nicer place. He knew better than to get comfortable. They had to stay under the radar. As he helped Emma off the bike, he scanned the area once more. No one seemed to be paying them any attention, but that didn't mean they weren't being watched. He needed to stay vigilant. They walked into the small office, where a tired-looking woman sat behind the counter. She glanced up when they entered, her gaze lingering on Jake for a moment before moving to Emma. Jake could see the judgment in her eyes, the way she looked at them like they didn't belong. But it didn't matter. He wasn't here to make friends. He just needed a place to lay low for a while. "One room for the night," Jake said, his voice steady. The woman nodded, handing him a key without a word. Jake paid in cash, not bothering with small talk. He had no interest in giving anyone more information than they needed. They took the key and made their way to the room, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. The room was small and dimly lit, the walls thin and worn. It wasn't much, but it was enough for one night. Jake locked the door behind them, checking the window to make sure it was secure. Emma immediately climbed onto the bed, lying down with a soft sigh. Jake stood by the door for a moment, listening to the sounds outside. It was quiet, too quiet, but he couldn't dwell on that. He had to focus on Emma. He walked over to the bed, sitting down next to her. She was staring at the ceiling, her hands resting on her chest, but her eyes were distant, lost in thought. "You okay?" Jake asked, his voice softer this time. Emma turned her head toward him, her expression unreadable. "I don't know," she whispered. "I'm scared." Jake nodded slowly, understanding more than she realized. He was scared too. Scared for her, scared for himself, scared of everything that was still out of his control. But he couldn't let her see that. He couldn't let her see the cracks in his armor. He had to be strong for her. "I know," he said quietly, "but we're going to be okay. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." Emma didn't respond. She didn't need to. The words hung between them, a silent promise that neither of them could break. Jake stood up and walked over to the small table by the window, staring out at the street below. He could see the faint glow of the streetlights, casting long shadows across the pavement. It was peaceful here, but he knew peace was fleeting. There were always consequences to running, to hiding, and sooner or later, those consequences would catch up to them. But not today. Today, they were safe. And that was all that mattered. We'll stay here for the night, Jake said, turning back to Emma. Tomorrow, we'll figure out our next move. Emma nodded, her eyes fluttering as sleep began to take hold. Jake watched her for a moment longer, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. They had to keep moving, but for now, they could rest. For now, they were together, and that was enough. The sun had barely started to rise when Jake opened his eyes. The room was still dark, save for the thin strip of light that crept in through the edges of the curtains. He lay there for a moment, listening to the quiet sound of Emma's steady breathing from across the room. It was peaceful, too peaceful, the kind of peace that made Jake uneasy. He had never been good at sitting still, never been one to let his guard down. Even in moments of calm, there was always a part of him that was watching, listening, waiting for the next threat to emerge. His eyes moved to the window, and he saw the soft light of dawn beginning to break through the sky. The air was cool, and the streets outside the motel were empty. It looked like another ordinary day, but Jake knew better than to take it at face value. He had learned the hard way that ordinary days often masked the most dangerous moments. He sat up slowly, his muscles stiff from the hours of riding, but he didn't mind. The pain kept him focused, reminded him of what was at stake. Emma was still asleep, curled up on the bed under the blanket. Jake had watched her fall asleep the night before, her small face peaceful for the first time in what felt like forever. He had wanted to stay awake, to keep watch, but the exhaustion had gotten the better of him. He had never been good at resting. He stood up quietly, careful not to wake her, and made his way to the small bathroom. As he splashed cold water on his face, he looked at his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him wasn't the same person he had been years ago, before everything had changed. But the weight of his past was still there, still lingering in the background, always threatening to drag him back in. He wiped his face with a towel and took a deep breath. He had made it this far, and he wasn't about to let his past ruin the future he was trying to build. Emma needed him, and that was all that mattered. As he walked back into the room, he saw Emma stirring on the bed. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him with a sleepy smile. "Morning," she said softly. "Morning," Jake replied, his voice low. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but there was something else there too. A quiet strength. She had come a long way since he had first found her. "You sleep okay?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Emma nodded. "I did. I don't know. I'm just trying to figure everything out." Jake understood. He had spent years running from his own demons, trying to outrun the past that kept chasing him. But now, he wasn't just running for himself. He was running for her, too. "I know," Jake said, his voice steady. "We'll figure it out. One step at a time." Emma looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think we'll ever be safe? I mean, for real." It was a question Jake had been asking himself for days, ever since they had started running. Would they ever find a place where they could just live, without looking over their shoulders? The truth was, he didn't know. But he couldn't tell her that. Not when she was looking at him with such trust in her eyes. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But I'll do everything I can to make sure you're safe." Emma didn't say anything, but the look she gave him spoke volumes. She believed him. And for the first time in a long time, Jake believed it too. "We should get going," Jake said after a moment. "We can't stay here long." Emma nodded, standing up and stretching. She grabbed her jacket from the corner of the room and slipped it on, ready to go. They didn't need to say much. The weight of their situation hung between them, but there was something reassuring in their silence. They were in this together. They had to be. Jake packed up their things quickly, making sure they weren't leaving anything behind. He grabbed his jacket and slid it on, then went to the window one last time to check the parking lot. Everything seemed calm, too calm. But that didn't mean they were in the clear. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. "Let's go," Jake said, turning to Emma. They walked out of the room and into the parking lot, the morning air crisp against their skin. Jake started the bike, feeling the engine come to life beneath him. Emma climbed on behind him, her small arms wrapping around his waist as they set off down the road. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Jake had no choice but to keep moving. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew they couldn't stop now. The road stretched before them, long and winding, but Jake wasn't looking back. The past could wait. For now, all that mattered was Emma and the promise he had made to protect her. They had no idea what challenges lay ahead, but they would face them together. That was enough for now.